Okay. Can you guys see?
Yeah.
All right. So I'll start with the first two slides, and then after that, Frixos and Eric will take turns with the reading. Yeah.
We're gonna go 2 slides each.
Okay.
Okay.
one?
Up to you. Up to you guys.
2.
All right. 2 slides each then. Okay. So this presentation is going to be about ecologically sustainable development in future environment management. And in this presentation, I'm going to be touching on these 3 pillars, which is economic, environmental, and social, when it comes to ecologically sustainable development. So what is sustainable development? Now, sustainable development has been defined in many ways, but one of the most common definition is sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. When applied in an ecological setting, to focus more on the environment, it can be called ecological sustainability. So this includes everything that's connected with the Earth ecosystems, which is the stability of the climate systems, the quality of the air, land and water, land use and soil erosion, and biodiversity. So diversity of both species and habitat. So basically, that's biotic and abiotic factors involved. And last but not least, you have the ecosystem services like carbon storage, pollination, and photosynthesis. Okay, so are you guys familiar, or have you actually looked into what are the ecosystem services in your individual areas where you live?
Can you explain what do we mean by ecosystem services?
Okay, very simple stuff. Basically, we talk about carbon storage by the trees around nature. You have pollination, which is performed by all kinds of pollinators, and of course, photosynthesis, which is the process of plants uh, converting carbon to oxygen. So let me share this link. Now, ecosystem services are performed by most things that biotic in nature. So it's like a service that is provided to us. Whether we recognize it or not, that's a different question. So here, there's a whole study on ecosystem services performed just by grasslands, right? And I've added this study here because I think it's very relevant to Brazil, right? Where the land that we're going to be working on has a lot of open space and grassland. So we'll explore later on what are the kind of ecosystem services that grasslands can actually provide us. Okay, so next, Frixos.
Ecologically Sustainable Development, ESD. ESD can be defined as using, conserving, and enhancing the community's resources so that ecological processes on which life depends are maintained, and the total quality of life now and in the future can be increased. The World Commission of Environment and Development also defined ESD, Ecologically Sustainable Development, in Our Common Future. Brundtland report as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Correct. It aimed to discuss the environment and development as one single issue. Under ESD, resources are not limited to minerals, food, or energy sources. ESD includes natural resources such as air, water, and soil, and social and cultural resources. If development is ecologically sustainable, natural resources and biological, cultural, and social diversity will be maintained or improved.
All right. Thanks, Frixos. Okay, so we were talking about ecological services on the earlier slide. Now, the other thing that we looked at in ESD are the ecological processes. So what are these ecological processes, right? It concerns nutrient flows throughout all the trophic levels and the food web, right? How nutrients and energies are channeled from primary producers to primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so forth. Decomposition by the microbes are also one of the ecological processes that are concerned with ESD. Okay, and has anybody heard of this body, Our Common Future, or the Brundtland report? Has anybody heard of it?
No, not me.
Okay, so this is one of the first report that came out back in the 80s, which actually took the initiative to discuss environment and development as one single issue. So I've included a link here for anyone who is interested to read about this report, which is basically one of the first steps that many countries came together and start to tackle these environmental and development issues, right? So I'll include the link after the presentation. I'll upload the file and then you can go through it and read it. It's kind of a back to basic report on how to tackle environmental issues, which I think really tackles a lot of the problems that still exist today since the 80s. Okay, moving on. So what are cultural resources? Now, when you enter an environment or when you want to develop a piece of land, one of the things that we have to take into consideration are the cultural resources, right? So what are the cultural resources that we'll be dealing with in Brazil, for example? So cultural resources involve traditional way of life, languages, historical properties. So if there's any structures or temples and stuff like that that is found on a piece of land, pre-contact properties, some people will call it. These are very important cultural resources that is taken into consideration under ESD as well. Then the next thing would be diversity, right? So in development that is ecologically sustainable, diversity is very important in terms of natural resources, biological, cultural, as well as social. All right. Next slide.
Ecologically Sustainable Development, ESD. In Australia, for example, the National Strategy for Ecological Sustainable Development stated the core objectives of ESD are 1. To enhance individual and community well-being and welfare by following a path of economic development that safeguards the welfare of future generations. 2. To provide for equity within and between generations. 3. To protect biological diversity and maintain essential ecological processes and life support systems. Two other principles of ESD described in the national strategy are 1. Incorporating ESD in decision making. When any decision is made, it has to consider environmental, social, economic, and equity factors. 2. The precautionary principle. Lack of proof is not a good enough reason to avoid deciding to reduce likely damage to the environment.
Okay, so again, ESD is very much focused on the welfare of the future generations, ecological processes, and here again, this part, the precautionary principle, it's a very important principle when it comes to development under ESD. So what does this mean when it says lack of proof is not a good enough reason to avoid deciding to reduce likely damage to the environment? So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a piece of land and you want to probably put 1,000 goats, right? We can. So you have to consider this. If somebody asks you, is it safe to put 1,000 goats in a certain landscape? You cannot go back to that person and say, well, you would have to prove that these 1,000 goats are going to cause a lot of damage, right? It doesn't work that way. If you lack of proof, if the person can't prove to you that this 1,000 goats is going to do a lot of damage to the environment, you would still have to be very careful and take precautionary steps before you undertake the cattle farming in such an area, right? So there are a couple of things that can be done prior to making a decision, and that will be covered in the slides to come. Okay, next slide. Eric?
Ecological Sustainable Development, ESD, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, in its discussions on the issue of sustainability in the 21st century, recognized three dimensions of sustainability: environmental, social, and economic. That these three dimensions were interlocked with one another. A framework for ESD can encompass these three dimensions in a way that, 1, recognizes the importance of ecological considerations, 2, adopts a precautionary approach to assessing risks, 3, ensures social equity in and between generations, 4, cultivates long-term global orientation, 5, maximizes efficiency of resource and energy use, 6, encourages public participation in decision-making. And a note, the green economy is different in that it focuses specifically on the sustainability of the economic pillar.
Fantastic. All right, so when we talk about the three pillars, environmental, social, and economic, we have to look at it as a global approach, right? It has to have a global orientation. The reason for that is that you want to avoid a lot of fragmentation, something that ecologists actually consider when studying environment and also habitats. So the same rule applies when we talk about ESD, because fragmentation means that everybody is doing things their own way, coming up with their own regulation that may or may not work on the countries or even cities that are next to them. So there will be no coordination, there will be no systematic approach. So these three pillars has to be interlocked and it has to have a global orientation. So that's pretty important. All right, next.
Ecologically Sustainable Development, ESD, Biodiversity Assessment, species richness, identifying and cataloging all species present in the area, including plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms. Population density, assessing the abundance and distribution of different species within the ecosystem. Genetic diversity, evaluating the genetic variability within populations of a species, which is crucial for their adaptability and resilience to environmental changes. Threat analysis, identifying and evaluating the major threats to biodiversity within the area, such as habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, climate change, and overexploitation. Conservation status, determining the conservation status of a species and ecosystems, including their vulnerability to extinction and the effectiveness of existing conservation measures. Ecosystem assessments, what habitat types, how much of each are present in the area of interest, how much woody biomass is present in the area of interest, what is the canopy structure of the area of interest, what is the state of the aquatic environments and the water sources in the area of interest, what are the patterns in annual primary productivity in the area of interest, and what is the amount of carbon stored, and how is it changing within the area of interest?
All right. Sorry, I think I might have skipped a slide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Anyway.
I'll read this as well. That's fine.
Okay.
Those tie together. But the ecological sustainable development practices recognize the need to change the way we treat environment if life is to be of good quality. This includes preserving and conserving environments. Preservation and conservation are both processes that protect the environment, but two approaches and concepts are quite different. One would be the conservation manages the environment through the responsible use of natural resources. For example, conserving a forest typically involves sustainable logging practices to minimize deforestation. And preservation protects the environment from harmful human activities. This involves setting aside a part or even all of an area from human development. And
thanks. Okay, so incidentally, when I was preparing this presentation, came across something quite interesting. So what happens when you don't conserve or preserve an area, for example, right? Now, this is a species that is actually pretty common throughout the world, right? Freshwater mollusks, as in clams or shellfish that lives in freshwater. But apparently, it's officially endangered in the state of Santa Catarina, right? So it lives in freshwater, in ponds, in rivers. And this is what happens if you don't take into consideration what to conserve and what to preserve in a natural environment. Even the most common species can become endangered, right? So these are the things that we have to consider. So what do we have to do when it comes to preservation and conservation are basically these two things, right? You have to do a biodiversity assessment of an area, and you have to do an ecosystem assessment of an area to actually truly understand what are the vulnerability of the species that exist there, and what are the future threats, what are the possible future threats that they may face in any development.
Can you also use that information for the benefit of your environment and maybe your agricultural setup?
Are you talking about the assessment here?
Yeah, all of this information. I mean, the species, the population, the canopies, and all of that.
Yes.
Can you use it in, in not just assess the risk, but also use it in benefit of your setup.
Definitely, because when you do these two assessments, what you're going to have is a good understanding of the ecological services as well as the ecological processes that takes place in that area, right? So these ecological services like pollination, for example, it's going to benefit your crops if you understand what kind of pollinators are there, what kind of invasive species are there, right? The invasive species, they may have their own ecological services, but they may impose a threat to your crops. And so is ecosystem assessment, right? Because here you're going to talk about water flow. You're going to talk about what kind of aquatic environment that is going to be available on that piece of land. And all this information is going to be very advantageous if you're going to undertake any development or agriculture or even cattle farming. Does that answer your question, Frixos?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, move on to the next slide.
Ecologically sustainable development. Pollution prevention. Any increase in human population in a natural environment can lead to increased pollution. However, pollution from human activities does not have to be inevitable. Pollution prevention aims to reduce the amount of pollution generated by a process, whether this be industry, agriculture, or by individuals. This approach seeks to increase the efficiency of a process, hence reducing the amount of pollution generated. This means finding new efficiencies, doing things smarter, and valuing every resource. Not only does industry play a big part in this, but consumers do also. Education is key, and use of the recycling mantra, rethink, refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, repurpose, can certainly help everyone in participation.
Okay, so yeah, pollution is all about prevention. It is not inevitable, and the approach seeks to increase the efficiency of a process. So whether it's going to be building a structure or agriculture or even building a greenhouse, what we do is you analyze the whole process of that undertaking and you try to shorten the process, right? You come up with a hypothesis and you evaluate and you shorten the process and you eliminate areas that can potentially pollute the environment. So when you go to a new piece of land, you can also assess what are the current practices, the current agricultural practices, the current cattle farming practices, and try to increase the efficiency of that process that is currently in practice. So this can be something that we can look at in Brazil in terms of the soybean cultivation and see what we can do. And the last part where we talk about the recycling mantra, I think Frixos would be the expert in this area because of what he's done with his dome and also the surrounding area where he lives. So one good example of repurpose would be what Frixos is doing with his dome, where it is a accommodation as well as a greenhouse, right? So if you repurpose something like that, you probably would not have to build another greenhouse. You would save on a lot of materials and probably prevent more pollution from building a new greenhouse altogether. But that's just one example. I mean, there are many ways to do it, but these are the things that has to be assessed as well.
And John, it would be an awareness of what our waste outputs are and how they become inputs into the local ecosystem or biome and how that affects.
Yes, because the approach should be, it's good that you touch on this, because I think in the slides to come there may be a mention, but whatever you produce should actually be absorbed by the environment without any ecological harm. That should be the best approach, right? That your output eventually is generated or processed to be your input again. Okay.
Yeah, well, there's an equilibrium between them, yeah.
Yeah, correct. Okay, who's next?
Biodiversity. Biodiversity is a measure of the relative diversity among organisms present in different ecosystems. This includes diversity within species, for example, genetic diversity, among species and among ecosystems. It provides the fundamental building blocks for the many goods and services a healthy environment provides. Sadly, despite global efforts to manage threats and pressures to biodiversity, it is still in decline. The main threats to biodiversity are loss, fragmentation, and degradation of habitat, the spread of invasive species, unsustainable use of natural resources, climate change, inappropriate fire regimes, changes to the aquatic environment and water flows, poaching, and illegal wildlife trades.
Yes.
What does it mean by inappropriate fire regimes? Are we talking about wildfires?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so when it comes to biodiversity, there's something that I've learned recently that I think it's very logical for any development, right? And that would be something called biodiversity net gain. Has anyone heard of this before? Biodiversity net gain?
I have.
Okay, great. So biodiversity net gain is a very straightforward approach whereby if you're going to develop a piece of land, you first assess the biodiversity, and that gives you an idea of what kind of ecosystem exists there, what kind of animals, what kind of fish, birds, and plants as well, right? What kind of trees are there? So a simple example would be, let's say there are 3 trees on a piece of land that you're going to develop. In order to achieve biodiversity net gain, if you're going to cut down those trees, you have to replace these trees in a higher amount to improve the ecosystem. Or you don't cut down those trees, you develop next to it, and whatever land that you're going to take up, if it's a disturbance to the population of the animals that exist there, you have to do something else to improve the population and the ecosystem, right? Just to make the place in a better state before you actually take, after you actually develop the place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you're going to do a biodiversity assessment after your development, it has to come out with better results, right? So that's what I mean. So it's to me, it's a very logical and straightforward approach, right? If you want to develop a natural piece of land, there are ways for you to consider how to actually improve it with the development that you're going to undertake. Okay, so biodiversity is basically the fundamental building blocks, right? For the many goods and services a healthy environment provides. So when you do your biodiversity assessment and you do your ecosystem assessment, you're going to have a good understanding of what are the goods and services that nature is already providing you on a piece of land, right? Now, you need competency when you undertake such an assessment. You really need a proper tools. You need an ecologist probably to actually go to the piece of land and conduct this assessment so that you have a really good understanding of the fundamental building blocks that exist there that are already providing for you, right? So who are these? What are these? So in Santa Catarina, there are the state, right? The state of Santa Catarina, there is about 11,000 species of birds, amphibians, arachnids, animals that are already providing you these goods and services. What are they and how do we benefit from it is something that we have to really take into consideration, and we have to think about ways of how we can improve the situation after development. Does that make sense?
So it would be like finding out what kind of inputs that these different animals, the plants or the bugs that they eat, and then the waste product they produce, and how that feeds back into the microbiome for the producer level.
Yes. And in truth, if you look at this kind of biodiversity, right, you cannot put an economic value on it, right? It's impossible. It's beyond money, right, so to speak. Now, you come across articles and reports of bees having economic value, right? That bees their ecosystem services are worth about 6 trillion or something like that a year or more, right? To me, that's very assumptuous and superficial, right? Because these are things that you can't really put a value to. And once any of these species are extinct, there's no way you can actually get them back, right? And you have no idea what kind of role they play and whether it's an important role in your ecosystem, in the habitat, unless you do a proper study. And that takes expertise as well. So this is what I mean by taking a precautionary approach, because these fabulous organisms and animals, they are vulnerable to any changes to the environment. Okay, so I talk about a global orientation, right? When we talk about the three pillars, the environmental, the economic, and the social. So does anybody know what it means by fragmentation in a habitat? Anybody heard of that? Habitat fragmentation.
I would suppose or suspect that it would be an example of a species going into extinction and then losing their inputs and outputs that feed into the rest of their local biome and habitat.
Okay, not exactly the definition, but it's obviously related, right? So I'll give you an example. What is habitat fragmentation? Can you see this small picture here? Right.
Yes.
So this is your piece of land, and you build a road across it. Okay. That's fragmentation, right? Now, why is this a concern for environmentalists or ecologists? It's because when you cut across a piece of land, there are lots of animals that are no longer able to cross over, or if they attempt to cross over, uh, they get killed by traffic, right? Now, why is this important? Why is this an existential threat to a lot of species? Um, every species, especially mammals, the bigger animals, they have a certain range, right? If you live on a piece of land and in a certain habitat, these animals have a range, and this range can be hundreds or even thousands of kilometers, square meters, right? So those are their breeding grounds that you are actually fragmenting. So when they are isolated, let's say you build a big highway and these animals are isolated in a certain area, the problem is when they lose that range, they start inbreeding, right? So the species diversity is going to suffer. So inbreeding is a problem because you have weaker genetic uh, outcome, right? They are more prone to diseases, and of course, the for predators, you're going to have a smaller area, which means smaller food source and things like that, right? So the solution nowadays, you get animal crossings across highways. I'm not sure if you've seen any. Personally, I have not. But these are things that essential for the survival of many species. So even birds are affected in this kind of fragmentation uh, in a way that if you are migrating species, right, migrating birds, building a road may not interrupt your route, but when you build a road, the aquatic environment may be affected, right? So whatever ponds or rivers that may be there that migrating birds are stopping by will be demolished, right? They vanish. So that is a problem because then these birds will have to divert somewhere else, and you never know what kind of danger they face when they have to divert their migrating routes, right? So migrating land animals as well are very threatened by this kind of fragmentation. Okay, so changes to aquatic environment and water flow, that's very important for biodiversity. Now, uh, we talked about biodiversity net gain earlier, right? So these changes can be positive. You can also make positive changes to this kind of environment, especially aquatic environment and water flows that may enhance the habitat or the ecosystem of a piece of land and benefit the organisms that live there. So when I think I've spoke about wildlife ponds for some time. So I like this picture because look at this picture and the kind of diversity in the pond, right? And think about what are their roles, what kind of ecosystem services that they are doing that we don't really observe or we often ignore, right? So that's just an example. Look at Brazil, right? When we talk about land in Brazil, there is a lot of water patches, a lot of natural ponds, right? So what are the conditions of these ponds? Are they healthy? Are they or empty. There's no diversity in them. These are the things that we have to consider, and it really takes very little to improve aquatic environment, right? If you have a pond and you observe it and it's lifeless, all you need to do is introduce some primary producers. Now, what do I mean by primary producers? These are aquatic plants or plants that you grow by the side of the ponds, which will actually create habitats for many useful insects, frogs, beetles, and you start finding some fish as well, right? So very easy way to improve and perform a biodiversity net gain in an aquatic environment. So that's if I were to go to a piece of land, those are the kind of environment that I would start with, right? And let this environment and ecosystem expand from there. All right, next slide.
Ecologically sustainable development, slide 10. Land use and soil erosion. Soil can be thought of as Earth's skin, and as human population has expanded, more and more of the Earth's skin has been cleared for agriculture and other pursuits that degrade the soil and make erosion more likely to occur. Although erosion is a natural process, the clearance and cultivation of land for agriculture and livestock, as well as the production of invasive species, have resulted in rates of soil loss many times higher than that in undisturbed environments. Without intervention, soil erosion can have adverse social, economic, and environmental impacts. Soil erosion depletes the productive capacity of the land as it removes nutrients, organic matter, and clay from the soil, which are important for plant growth. The effects of soil erosion go beyond the loss of fertile land. It has led to increased pollution and sedimentation in the streams and rivers, clogging these waterways and causing declines in fish and other species. Degraded lands are often less able to hold onto the water, which can worsen flooding.
All right, thank you. Okay, so what kind of invasive species do you think, or can you think of, that can cause soil erosion?
I think of, go ahead, Frixos.
No, I was wondering, are we talking about plant species or animal species?
Both. Can be
Okay.
any species.
Go ahead, Eric, then.
I was thinking of something, but it may not be considered invasive species, but I know in the mid-states of the United States, they have a prairie dog infestations. So I don't know if that's because of the development of those lands artificially increasing a natural population. I don't know if that would be a fair analogy to it, but invasive species that I think of is one of the most common here in the States is kudzu, the kudzu plant, which is a very difficult plant to rid. Its vines grow up into the trees, and its foliage covers trees, so they aren't able to process the light from the sun, the photosynthesis, and can starve and kill trees. And I think of well, leave that
Actually,
there.
that's a very good example, because when the trees are destroyed by these invasive species, obviously you're going to have a higher chance of soil erosion. But I found a very interesting one. Just let me share this with you. Okay, so when you look at this picture, right, and you look at this lush green growth next to a stream or a river, you would think that it is unlikely that soil erosion is going to be a problem, right?
Mhm.
So the species I'm talking about here is the knotweed, right? Now they cause a big problem to soil erosion in the rivers simply because they are herbaceous perennials, right? So in the summer, they grow very lush, but when it comes to winter, they die off, right? And when they die, they leave the land exposed. So when it snows, everything goes down into the river, including the dead plants itself, and they clog up the river downstream. And it happens all the time, and they come back every year. So it's very difficult to get rid of because these invasive species, they grow very robustly. So you really have to put in a lot of effort to clear everything. And if you don't do that, they'll come back and you face the same problem again and again every year. So that's one example of a plant, invasive plant that can cause a lot of soil erosion next to a river.
Yeah, that's why when we discuss vetiver, they have deep root system, not fibrous root system. So they will never go extinguished in all seasons. If we are planting vetiver on this kind of soil beds or near river or wherever there is a chance of soil erosion, vetiver is likely to plant for that purpose.
Yep. And vetiver is not a perennial, right? It's not a weed. You see, it's a grass. So grasses, they don't die off and come back, right? They're
Yes.
there as long as the environment is sustainable. So these are things that we have to take into consideration when you start working on a land, because when you have people moving around, you can accidentally carry seeds and stuff like that. So it's good to be aware of what invasive species can do when it comes to soil erosion as well.
And
Okay, so yeah, go ahead, Eric.
and it would be a fair analogy to compare the human practice of monoculture farming to something similar to like an invasive species, either the kudza or the knotweed.
In a way, yes, because basically when you do monoculture, you destroy the diversity, right, of that environment. And when you have diversity that is actually very low, then the soil itself becomes eroded, right? You lose all the diversity of the microbes, and after your harvest, what do you do with the land? So the practice of monoculture has to be taking into consideration what you do before the harvest, during the cultivation, and after the harvest, right? Do you leave the land bare? What happens to the land? And all these factors can contribute to soil erosion for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so here we talk about intervention, right? So without intervention, soil erosion can really have an adverse effect on all these three pillars that we talk about. So what kind of intervention can we do? I was thinking about Santa Catarina and also Paso dos Fernandes specifically. And have a look at this. Now, one of the things that you can do to actually reduce erosions are actually ground covers, right? obviously you need to grow something on the soil so that the soil is not exposed, so that, when it rains, it's not washed off. Now, these are basically unconventional food plants, right? What I mean by unconventional food plants or food crops, these are not cultivated, or they're not really cultivated for food or in monoculture, but they grow in the wild and they provide a lot of food source for any ecosystem, and even humans, especially those hunter-gatherers in the past, and also the traditional folks that lives in the forest. These are shrubs, basically, right? So shrubs are very easy to grow, right? You do not have to actually fertilize them. They are less invasive than wheat. So these are things that we can consider to introduce. These are all native species, by the way, right? So we're looking at native species in Santa Catarina. So these unconventional food plants or shrubs can be introduced to a landscape to improve the ground cover, and it provides for the pollinators, and it provides for whoever that's living there as well. There's this fruit that I come across. Let me find it. Yeah, this is very interesting, right? VKN, you were talking about strawberries, right? So this is a type of fruit that's called a strawberry guava, right? That is actually found in the wild in Brazil and also in Santa Catarina. Then you have the Suriname cherry. So these are things that you can introduce to the landscape as remediation practice or exercise to reduce soil erosion, to improve the ground cover, and additional food source for the residents of that area. And in Brazil, well, so far, there are 62 species that can be considered that we can introduce, right?
Sounds delicious.
It does, especially the strawberry guava. Because we get a lot of guava in Malaysia. Obviously, you have tasted strawberries, so I could be a good combination.
Looks small ones. They must be very tasty.
Yeah.
Yes.
Probably extremely nutritious.
Yeah,
definitely.
And they actually, if you talk about shrubs, right? These shrubs or wild berries that grows on their own naturally, especially native species, they are very beneficial to the native bees, right? Native bees are very vulnerable if they don't have native species to support them. So these are the pollinators that will be attracted to the place, and then they perform the ecosystem services to the area, right? So it's a win-win situation. So that's what the kind of intervention that one can do, and it really costs very little because these are things that grow in the wild, right? They occur naturally because they are native species. So you just have to basically look for them.
And they're much more resilient and pest resistant also, and probably need more attention than imports.
They need no attention. You don't have to kind of water them. You don't have to fertilize them. They grow on their own naturally.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think because from what we have observed in Brazil, on the land, there are some areas of erosion. Also areas where there's very little vegetation on the surface. So these are the things that we have to act before the situation gets worse. All right, next.
I guess I'll read this one. So who is responsible for ecological sustainable development action? In reality, everyone is responsible to act in a way which will make our future sustainable. Government agencies are responsible for providing guidance and regulations. Businesses and individuals are responsible to act in a way that does not compromise the access of resources to others or future generations. So how do we recognize ecological sustainable development? We know development is sustainable when renewable resources can generate faster than we can use them. Renewable alternatives replace the use of non-renewable resources. Wastes are absorbed by the environment without affecting it in the long or short term. Biological diversity is maintained and species loss, if not the direct or indirect result of human activity.
Thank you. All right, so who is responsible? Now we have to talk about regulations. How much do we actually understand what are the environmental regulations of a place, right? Brazil, for example, this is very interesting. Apparently, Brazil is the first G20 country that tracked the sustainable development of all its cities, right? So what's the closest city to Pasos dos Fernandes?
Largest.
Largest, right? So we might have to look at what's happening in Largest. What kind of application, what kind of regulation they have when it comes to any sort of development, and also the areas surrounding Largest, whether that has any implication at all. Well, apparently they take it quite seriously, and it's quite a big ask for Brazil to actually track all of its cities. It's a big country. Okay, next.
The community benefits from ESD through confidence in its future quality of life, protection of important social, cultural, and environmental resources, fair access to resources, involvement in decisions which affect it. Industry benefits from ESD through reduced overheads through efficient use of energy and raw materials, lower charges for waste disposal through wise use of resources, reduced business costs through consistent environmental laws, a green quote-unquote marketing advantage, fair competition for those acting responsibly, the knowledge that it has the support of its workforce, government, and the community. Theoretically, of course, because sometimes the industry does just the opposite, I guess.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Right. So, I mean, basically, we ask ourselves, what do I get for ESD and so forth? But to me, the more important question would be, Eric?
What can we do for a piece of land before we start taking from it?
Right. So that to me is the more important question, right? Before we work on any environment, any piece of land, can we first evaluate and improve the condition? And then would that give us better considerations of what we can then do on that piece of land?
Well, I think the answer to this question is that we have to start giving to it before we start taking from it. I think that's how it goes.
Yep, that's my line of thinking as well. Okay, so with this, that's the end of my presentation. I'll stop sharing now.